Welcome into episode 111 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Ptacek.
Fast on the heels of iOS 12 came macOS Mojave, and fast on our look at privacy and security features in iOS 12 comes a similar show for the Mac. Less than a month old, you may be waiting to pull the trigger on this Mac update. Today we'll dive deeper into it and help you make that decision. The items that we are checking off today: what's new in macOS Mojave? Saddle up, friends, as we ride into another checklist brought to you by SecureMac. As iOS gets more advanced, we find more and more features shared between Apple's mobile operating system and the one built for traditional computers. Some of what we're talking about that's new in macOS Mojave will sound familiar if you listened to last week's show when we covered what's new in iOS 12. For example, better password management has come to both iOS 12 and Mojave. Mac Rumor says macOS Mojave is gaining support for automatic strong passwords, with Safari automatically creating, autofilling, and storing passwords. Passwords on macOS Mojave will be flagged if they've been reused, making it easier for users to create unique passwords for each login. That could practically have been pulled from last week's show. Here's what I wonder, though. While Apple has made all of this much easier, is it easy enough that everybody's going to be on board?
I hope so. It's with each step they take, it's making it, I don't know, it's giving users more and more reason just to go ahead and be secure versus, I'm going to write my same password down and use it on every single website. I'm hoping, for people that already had password managers on macOS prior to Mojave, they may or may not switch. I still haven't switched over to entirely using the built-in password management stuff in Mojave, but I'm starting to add more and more passwords just because it's really easy. Safari goes, "Hey, do you want me to create a strong password for you?" And it's super fast, and Apple really, I have to give them props because it's integrated really well into the operating system. I'm hoping to see more of an adoption on people who don't even have password managers right now. I was at my grandmother's house this weekend, and she wanted me to fix something on her computer, and she needed to look up her passwords, and she pulled out this book of passwords, like physical book, and had to find the right page and all that other stuff. And so something like that, where you might have a user who's not super technically adept, that's a perfect use case scenario for this new feature. And I'm really hoping to see a pretty widespread adoption in that regard.
Now, how many of her passwords were the same in that little notebook?
Here's the funny thing. They were all different from what I saw, and they were all really pretty secure. So she was just like one step away from making it really easy for her, which would be have the computer keep track of all of those and autofill them for her. Then she doesn't have to look them up in the book.
But even seeing when you create the password, or you're looking at your list of passwords and seeing that a certain or particular password has been used on however many other sites, makes you kind of scratch your head and go, yeah, like those are the sites I don't really care about. And then you start going through the list and go, oh, well, I kind of use that site. And then sooner or later, you're going to hear about one of those sites getting hacked. And then your password for all these other sites are cross-shared. I mean, it's super cool that this feature exists there, and they're making it so when you enter that password and you're saying, oh, wait, I've used this password on 347 other sites. Maybe I should try using this auto password generation technology that they are pushing in front of me. I think a lot of people are going to use it, and it's going to be better for everybody.
Here's one of the things I wonder about. So if somebody buys a new Mac and they're new to the Mac, they've always had a Windows machine, and they go to the Apple Store and they say, do you want to do, some kind of training or something like that? I mean, people coming new to the Mac ecosystem may be interested in all of this new stuff that they're seeing for the first time, right? And then on the other end, there are people like you guys. I mean, security-minded people who keep up with every new thing that Apple does for, security-minded individuals. And then I'm thinking about all the people who switched in the last, 5 to 10 years, who, came off of Windows XP, say, or Windows, I can't remember what the ones were around, 2000, 2005, things around there.
Vista.
Okay. So people basically coming off of a bad Windows experience, came into the Mac, learned all the new stuff for the Mac, and pretty much feel like they're done at that point. I mean, are these people... I'm wondering if Apple needs to do some sort of outreach thing. If Apple needs to do something to say to people, yeah, no, it's great you're here. I'm glad you are. And you've been more secure probably over the last few years. But let's keep talking about ways that we're making it better. Because if you don't watch WWDC or if, something like that, you might not even realize this stuff is happening. And when Apple comes up and says, hey, do you want to do this? No. And move on. I mean, is there more that Apple could do here, or do you think this is simple enough that the average John and Jane are going to go for it?
Here's the problem with either forcing a user to do something or making the feature kind of get in the way of whatever the user's trying to do. The result is that the user will click no, decline, close, cancel, postpone. I don't want to do the update now. I don't want to do this because it's complicated. And that's the exact opposite of what you want for security. So the fact that they made it so streamlined and so easy, you go to log into a website and you type your password, it will say, do you want Safari to save this password for you? If you go to a website that you haven't had an account on, you're creating an account, it will say, do you want me to autofill a strong password for you and save it for you? It is so not in the way. There's literally like no extra step a user has to take. If you're using Safari, it is automatically taking those steps for you. And to be honest, guys, it has been really easy just to say, okay, sure, Apple, go ahead and do that. Because even with 1Password, which is what I was using previously, if you wanted to, it would offer to save your passwords after you type something in. But if you were creating a new password, there's still like an extra click that you'd have to do to have 1Password auto-generate and fill a password for that site. And the fact that it's already built into Safari and already automatically filling in those password fields with a strong password, that is taking a step away from what's needed to be secure, which is a good thing in this case, in my opinion.
And think about how many years we've been promoting people to use password management software. I'll get to it, or I have my own system, or now this kind of puts it out there where you don't need to learn a new piece of software, where you don't need to subscribe to a service. I think more and more people are going to start using this, and I think it's awesome.
Obviously, one of the big strengths, and we actually talked about this last week when we were covering iOS, obviously one of the big strengths is you're on a Mac, you're using Safari, you're on your iOS device, you're using Safari, you've got the same password on both of those things. It's part of the whole ecosystem. One assumes that that's happening through iCloud. The question that I have is, if, somehow somebody gets access to your iCloud account, be it, you're accused of no good and so the authorities come in, or somebody just figures out a way into your iCloud account, are the passwords encrypted in iCloud, or is my password now accessible to somebody who somehow gets access to that? Obviously iCloud is protected, but should somebody get in, do they then have a list of my passwords, or is that just, secret voodoo stuff that the computers are doing in the background using iCloud as a pass-through?
Second one. There's not, like, if they got your iCloud password, there would be other stuff they'd have to do. They'd have to set up a computer with that account. They'd have to log into it. If you had two-factor authentication turned on, you'd have to get through that. You basically have to set up a device to be not only using that iCloud account, but also trusted with the way you can set up trusted devices. And there are steps Apple took to mitigate that. But yes, it's a risk. And it's a risk no matter what method you're using for storing your passwords. If you're using one of the third-party apps that stores their database on their own servers, or on Amazon Web Services, anything like that, AWS stuff, if you have the data located anywhere else, and someone breaks into that system, yes, they could technically steal it. And then what they do with it would depend on the level of security that the provider is putting in place in the background. Obviously, we don't know that with Apple. That would be one of their things they'd keep close to their vest. But I would say that Apple's stance on the security there is going to be strong. I trust them with all the rest of my iCloud information. I know in the past I was really hesitant to have passwords stored in web browsers. And I said that on the show. And that's because there have been incidences in the past where the password database for Chrome or for Safari or what have you was, there were local exploits on the computer where a program could basically get into those databases and start basically pilfering passwords. And that changed a lot when Apple moved everything to the iCloud keychain a few years back. And I had, I believe in earlier episodes had talked about that, how things have been getting a lot better on that front as far as trusting Apple with that. And at this point, I'm perfectly happy to promote that as a very valid password manager use or application or whatever you want to call it. I would use iCloud Password. I do use iCloud Password now. I am still using it in addition to 1Password, but I think Apple has really come a long ways in a fairly short time with ease of use and everything else.
I got one other question really quickly. You said earlier, if you've already been to a website and you have a password and, you can basically set Safari to autofill the password that you had created. How easy is it to change the password that you have to auto-creating one? I mean, so Safari is good enough to know that, okay, so I log into Mail, and it's still Mailman1234 is my password. But I realized finally that Mailman1234 is probably not the best password for me. So if I then go into, I guess, the web interface for whatever email account and go into change password, at that point, is Safari smart enough to go, oh, hey, this is a new password field. I'm going to go ahead and generate that same one twice? Or is it only for new accounts?
No, it will as.
No, you can change, yeah.
All right. So really, I mean, I think the only thing that concerns me is it still looks magical for people. It still looks like something, because when they flash up that thing that's like 16 characters, some are numbers, some are letters, some are upper space, some are lower space, some are hyphens, people might look at that and say, I'm never going to remember that. And because that's the thing, it's always been a struggle between a secure password and one that you're going to know. You're basically saying, if you're all Apple all the time, if you're all Safari all the time, it's okay to forget your password.
It's been okay to forget your password as long as you're using a password manager app.
Right.
All you had to do, up to this point, say it was 1Password or LastPass or any of the other apps, you only had to remember 2 passwords. You had to remember the password for your Apple ID, so you could re-download it from the App Store if you needed to. And you'd have to remember the password for your vault, the vault of all your other passwords.
Right.
And so that's already was meaning that you only had to remember, a couple things. And now Apple's taking that a step further, and you just have to basically remember your Apple ID password. So in that regard, I mean, I think it's a good thing, because even when it's showing those complex passwords, it's showing them just to prove to you that it made you a complex password. It's really nothing you have to remember. It could technically just be a little box that says, we created a really secure password. You trust us. It's the same thing. It's just proving that Apple did create a secure password. You could write it down if you really wanted to, but you don't have to.
The best part is when the website doesn't even support that password. It's too long, too many characters.
And that's something I've noticed with password managers in general. And when you see that on a site and it's, they pop up that little message saying, oh, your password doesn't meet our requirements. And you look at the requirements, it's like 8 to 12 characters, and you can't have special characters. It's just, you want to shake your head and go, no, that's really a bad sign. And there are way too many websites that happens with these days.
In addition to strengthening passwords last week, we also talked about ways that Apple was cracking down on tracking by advertisers and appropriation, let's say, of user data by social media giants like Facebook and Facebook. Both macOS and iOS 12 got versions of Safari that make it easier to control your online privacy. They also added some automatic protections. The way Apple illustrates it, remember when you looked at that green mountain bike online and then saw annoying green mountain bike ads everywhere you browsed? Safari uses machine learning to identify advertisers and others who track your online behavior and removes the cross-site tracking data they leave behind. So your browsing history stays your business. And now Safari keeps embedded content such as like buttons, share buttons, and comment widgets from tracking you without your permission. In other words, Facebook and others won't be able to build a profile of you by registering a hit from your account when you visit a website with a like button. Even if you don't hit the like button, they were still able to do that. Similar restrictions will be in place to stop device fingerprinting as well. That's using identifiers unique to your device to build a profile that doesn't rely on tracking cookies. And we actually did a bigger definition of device fingerprinting on last week's episode if you want to check that out. I gotta say, this sounds like one of the most private browsing experiences out there. Is that just how it sounds, or is that the case?
Yes, at the moment. There are a few things to keep in mind, however. The first one will be that the tracking companies will be doing whatever they can to figure out ways to get around it. So it's going to turn to another cat and mouse game. But right now, this is really great. However, keep in mind another thing. This is only applicable to third parties that are tracking you through things like device fingerprinting, traditional tracking cookies, similar means with your web browser itself. It will not stop a site from knowing that you're visiting it, because they could just check their server logs and your IP address would appear there. And it will also not stop your internet service provider or your VPN provider, if you're using one of those, from knowing the sites you're visiting. The way it works, they have to know that you're visiting whatever website. They don't see what you're doing on the website, but they would see that the requests are being made to that website. But nonetheless, this step that Apple has taken should be extremely helpful in cracking down on the tracking that is done by third-party advertisers, social media sites, and so on.
Obviously, the tracking cookies are still out there, but Apple has somehow figured out an algorithm to detect and delete them. Is that how this works?
Yes. They introduced that a couple of years ago on the Mac initially, and it was they basically can check and see if a cookie that is being issued by a site is coming directly from that site, or if it's coming from a different domain or subdomain or whatever, and it will actually quarantine cookies that are from third-party sites. And there's a limited time frame where the cookie can function, so when you're actually on that site and doing whatever you're doing, the site will function normally. But then when you leave the site and you either visit it later or visit a different site, the tracking cookies are quarantined. They're actually not accessible in the web browser to whatever site you're visiting. So it stops the tracking from working, because that cookie's not checking in with the server saying, oh yeah, hey, we're on this site now too. It's really basically a way that they're stopping that from happening in the first place. And it really made advertisers mad.
So there's also an option to let the social media buttons through, to allow them basically to do what they're trying to do. Is there any reason that people might want to do that?
If they're really into social media and they are just sharing the articles and things like that, and that's really where that comes into play.
Yeah, there's no other real reason. If you really like sharing those links, otherwise it's just, if you don't have it enabled, just copy and paste the link manually, like we did before social media existed.
Oh, it was a simpler time then.
In the ancient past.
But then if you're pasting it on social media anyway, and then that profile exists on you anyway, then why do you care about all this anyway?
Golly, that's... whatever. You don't think... it's kind of fun to think, okay, well, there's a button down there and I can eliminate that button and then I'm safe. But then you're right. Everything you do online is still being tracked somehow. It's just a question of, are you actively participating in that tracking, I suppose, as opposed to just, going from site to site to site without really thinking about it.
And then if you're not, how long until the advertisers are just selling the data that they have, the websites that you're accessing, the newspapers, things like that, are selling the data to the advertising companies, to Facebook, to all of these other companies, aggregating all their data together.
We talked last week about all the mother may I that iOS 12 is playing, specifically Siri in iOS 12 is playing with users. People who've upgraded may have noticed similar requests for permissions in macOS Mojave as well. While earlier versions of macOS had asked for some permissions, now, according to Mac Rumors, Apple is extending privacy protection to the camera, microphone, and other sensitive user data that includes mail database, message history, Safari data, Time Machine backups, iTunes device backups, locations and routines, and system cookies. They go on to say that apps will need express user consent for all API and direct access to these resources, with users able to access their security preferences in the security section of system preferences. There's an obvious upside to this. I mean, if some piece of malware or, software, which are the same thing, it's just one's automatically bad, the other one is a bit more ambiguous in what it does. If some piece of software is trying to use your camera without you knowing it, you will know it with Mojave.
Right. Take a piece of malware like Fruit Fly. It could spy on people using the webcam on the Mac. Under the new OS, Mojave will warn you about what's about to happen and ask for your permission. And that should make it a lot harder for apps to gain access to your data without explicit consent. Though this does mean you should still carefully consider your choices when you get one of these warnings.
I guess the only thing I wonder, is there a danger of too many requests for permission? Does any part of either of you guys worry that people will just go ahead and click allow the way that we, click that we've read the end user license agreements or that we've read the privacy policies, without actually reading them?
Well, remember years ago when Microsoft started doing all the authorization requests, giving things permission, one after another, people who used Macs were making fun of it. Like, you had to give permission for everything. And then it just got to a point where, did you really know what you were giving permission to? I think the same goes for this on Macs. But when you're using a new app for the first time and you're wondering why this painting program wants to have access to all of your contact list, and this game wants to have access to your camera when it's not doing anything with it. Those are the type of things that should make you go, wait a minute, do I want to allow that access?
And Apple definitely, you actually kind of took the idea right from my mouth. Vista was the operating system that Microsoft made, where it was asking you if you wanted to allow access all the time. And Apple clearly took that misstep by Microsoft into account. Their end result is a lot more balanced. There's still a lot left to be desired, but they're kind of limiting the number or the situations where these things will appear, these pop-ups that will ask if you want to give permission. Some of them require actual steps that the app can't just access, can't just say, hey, I need access to this specific set of files. It's a little more complicated than that. So I think Apple's trying to strike a balance. They're not quite there yet. But I'm hoping that, as Nick was saying, right now it's going to make you think, hey, why does this want my contacts? And maybe have those alerts appear a little less often. You don't need to have it appear on every single file, because there's a lot of stuff on your computer that it really doesn't matter what is trying to read that data, because it's just a computer file that's part of the operating system or whatever. So I think Apple is trying to do the right thing here. I think they've got some work to do. But I'd say they're erring on the side of not having users just click allow to everything, because they want users to understand that, hey, these apps are asking for your data and most likely want to use it for some reason that might not be totally on the level.
One more notable addition to Mojave, a feature called notarization. Even though Apple puts a lot of emphasis on the Mac App Store, there's still plenty of software you can find outside of it, typically signed with a valid developer ID. We talked about those on episode 60 of the checklist, Safety, in the App Store if you want to check that out. Here's the thing, though, they're no guarantee that software isn't malicious, but they are one line of defense. Apple strengthened that line in Mojave. Notarization will let Mojave users know for sure that a third-party app from outside the App Store has been double-checked by Apple and that it's free from malware. Eventually, Apple plans to require all developer ID apps to be notarized before they can be installed, but Apple says this is not an app review process and is used exclusively to analyze apps for security purposes. This, on top of the new runtime protections to keep malicious apps from injecting code into vulnerable third-party software, mean that Apple is continuing its focus on locking down the system. All right, there's something on here that confuses me a bit. So the whole thing is, because we've talked before about how there are basically 3 ways that you can get apps on your computer. You can set your computer so that you only buy things that are from the Mac App Store, or install things that are from the Mac App Store. You can do sort of like a trusted, but maybe from outside the Mac App Store. And then there's what we have colloquially referred to as the Wild West setting, which is basically anything you find online, go ahead and install it on your Mac. Notarization seems to be about apps that are coming from outside, but it's still requiring people to play nice, which sounds like sort of that middle ground that we had talked about before. What's the difference between what Apple had and this new notarization feature?
This is kind of extending, to an extent, the app review process that occurs with Mac App Store apps to kind of cover, to an extent, apps that are third-party from outside the Mac App Store. The problem was that a lot of malware authors wanted to install their malware on Macs, and they didn't want users to necessarily have to switch to the Wild West setting in order to have it be successful because, hey, extra steps mean less chance of malware getting installed. So what they would do is they would buy a legitimate developer ID program from Apple for $99 a year, or they'd steal one from somebody else or whatever, and they'd basically release third-party outside the Mac App Store apps. If a user allowed apps from outside the Mac App Store to be installed that had a correct developer ID on them, it would get installed and it could run. And if you're not in the Mac App Store, your app can do a lot more. It's not restricted by what Apple will allow apps to do. That they basically have to pass a review to get in the Mac App Store, and Apple doesn't like you doing some stuff, so that some apps they wouldn't let into the Mac App Store. So previously, the developer ID side of things was to let developers still release apps that wouldn't pass Apple's approval otherwise, and this notarization is kind of saying, hey, okay, we were a little too lax with that security. People are getting away with some bad stuff with developer IDs. So we need to have something more in place. It doesn't have to be a full App Store review. We're not going to be checking for a lot of things we check in the App Store to make sure it's meeting requirements for, adult content or what you can access or sandbox stuff. It's saying we're going to check for some basic security issues that we need to prove that your app isn't malicious. It's not trying to access certain things in the system. It's not trying to run some exploits against the operating system to steal your files and data. And so it's just taking the existing developer ID program a step further and saying, hey, we know you gave us $99, but that's not enough for us to trust you. We need to do a little bit more digging.
Now, I know there are some problems with Mojave. And we're actually going to talk about those problems in next week's episode. But I'd sort of promised at the beginning of the show that we were going to help people decide whether or not Mojave was right for them, whether it was something that they should install. Some of the problems that we've talked about are things that have been presenting like real issues for developers, maybe for more hardcore users. If I am talking to my mom and she's running High Sierra, can she go ahead and switch to Safari? To Mojave? I'm like, is this something that you would suggest for Joe Q public, for the average John and Jane, for just the run of the mill? I surf the web, I check Facebook, I do a little banking. Is it time for those people to upgrade, or should everybody wait?
I would say go ahead and upgrade. I have, and I've been using it as my primary operating system, and for the vast majority of the time, it's been perfectly well behaved. There have been a few bugs, but I would say at this point the security improvements outweigh the downsides. So yes, I would say for the majority of our listeners and majority of folks out there, they can upgrade to Mojave without any problem.
Plus the dark mode. That is pretty snazzy.
Dark mode was like the thing that everybody was writing about the day this came out. That was like, yeah, it was kind of funny how excited people were by that or about that. But yay, dark mode. And, privacy and security. It's like I said last week about iOS 12. Yay, Memoji. And privacy and security.
Which I still haven't even done.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I don't even know how to get to it. Well, I got some playing to do.
I guess so. In the meantime, if you would like to dive deeper into today's topics, there's a fantastic website for you to do that. It is securemac.com/checklist. You'll find notes for this show all the way back to, episode 60, which I mentioned earlier. Actually, it goes further back than that. It goes all the way back to episode 1. all the notes and places that you can listen to each show, all in one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.